Hello, good evening. My name is Miguel Amado, and I am the director of the Series Art Centre, an organization based in Cove, County Cork. Welcome, everyone, to this session of our William Thompson Forum series. I'm very happy with the opportunity to have Dr. Eve Olney joining us today for a fantastic talk and discussion on themes around the commons and some of our work, research, and initiatives. The William Thompson Forum is a series of online talks and discussions which we initiated a few months ago, and we will continue in September, from September onwards. William Thompson was a radical person, I would say, a thinker, a practitioner, a social reformer, considered the first Irish socialist, and he was based in County Cork, and his work has really been fundamental in paving the ground for what became feminism, some of Marxist theories, cooperative movements, and many other areas that were progressive at the time and which still resonate today. So we have named this series after him as a sort of connection with the radical tradition in this area of Ireland and of the world, as a tool to bring together people, speakers, and participants in conversations around what we consider topical terms, topical issues, critical matters, urgent matters of our times. So today, as I just said, I'm very happy and delighted and honored to have Eve here. I moved to Ireland a few years ago, and Eve was one of the first persons I met. And we met because we had shared and mutual interests in a lot of things. And I think this is actually the first formal opportunity for us to be together in an event. But a lot of things that I've been trying to do have been informed and inspired by some of the conversations that we have had in the past. And I hope also that these conversations will continue in the future. So thank you so much. I won't introduce more formally Eve. She can always refer to her work, but she's a really active person, not only in Cork City and Cork County, but beyond, and operating across different fields from artistic work, activism, research, organizer, curator, producer. And it's really interesting to have someone like her operating in this area, because this brings a really fresh, but also very community embedded way of thinking and way of practicing, resisting to the mainstream environment in which we live. So thank you so much. We'll hear now from Eve, and then after there will be opportunities for all of us to interact with her or among ourselves. Thank you so much. Eve, it's your time.
Thank you, Miguel. I'm just going to share my screen and check that.
Yeah.
This is, I've just noticed that sometimes the slides don't move on. So I'm just going to test that. Does that?
Yes,
that works. Yes, you can see second slide. Great. Okay. Yeah. Again, thanks to Miguel for inviting me here to talk at the William Thompson Forum. So I'm going to talk about the living commons, but I suppose that's kind of the central component of my work. But then how all the other things I'm involved in kind of fold into that as well. So I'll outline the development, and I have slides here as well, because I know sometimes it's very hard just to be spoken at for a length of time. So I have text in the slides as well, if you start kind of wandering. So I'm going to outline and develop the development of the Living Commons, which we're framing as a social political project, and it's based in Cork. The main purpose of the Living Commons is to build a holistic social, ecological, living, working, learning scheme with a focus on the socially and culturally disadvantaged. The objective of the scheme is to bring those currently working in activism under different objectives together within a joint program of social change that's based upon common needs. Its intent is to bring existing grassroots activism beyond categories of opposition to different crises and towards a common goal of concrete social change through a direct democratic self-organized common assembly scheme of reinstituting projects of social production. And I use the term here, reinstituting. I'm drawing directly from the political philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis' concept of reinstituting. So the long-term goal then is to create a self-sustaining holistic scheme that stretches across Ireland and beyond, hopefully, and integrates with those beyond, and serves as an example of an alternative way of living beyond a capitalist socio-economy and market-led culture. So the idea then of this type of kind of holistic collective design then as a praxis is being critically framed as both emergent and continuous and both material and philosophical process of community building. So the two kind of emerge together, both the material and the philosophical are constantly kind of working together. The underlying organizational principles are drawn from the project of direct democracy as epitomized by Castoriadis' political praxis of autonomy, and the social ecologist Murray Bookchin's communalism or libertarian municipalism. So it all began for me when I worked with an urban activist group in Athens. They're based in Athens called Urban React, and they're currently involved in a long-term housing project with inhabitants in a housing block in Kesariani, which is a suburb in Athens. And then I suppose the experience that I gained from working in Athens, I brought with me in co-founding the Living Commons in Ireland, which was very specifically kind of an attempt to build a perceptible culture of resistance within a neoliberal Ireland with others, with collectively as opposed to like individually. I just thought it might be useful as well to unpack some of the terms I'm using, because terms now like social, ecological are very commonly used, I find, across different forums and practices. But what I find is that Cornelius Castoriadis and Murray Bookchin are still very unknown within particularly European academia, which, I find curious. So my understanding of social ecology would come directly from Murray Bookchin, and he frames it as a coherent vision of social development that has for decades argued that we must reorder social relations so that humanity can live in a protective balance with the natural world. And that social ecology seeks the creation of a rational society in which waste and excess will be controlled by a new system of values, which aren't obviously economically driven. And if shortages arise as a result of irrational behavior, popular assemblies will establish rational standards of consumption by democratic processes. So again, the idea of incorporating common assembly process within kind of a social organizational framework. So in short, social ecology favors management, plans and regulations formulated democratically by popular assemblies, not freewheeling forms of behavior that have their origin in individual eccentricities, as we might say our current state does. So then communalism he describes as the overarching political category most suitable to encompass the fully thought out and systemic views of social ecology. Communalism seeks to recapture the meaning of politics in its broadest, most emancipatory sense, indeed to fulfill the historic potential of the municipality as the developmental arena of mind and discourse, a free society based on a shared common humanity. Freed of domination as well as material exploitation, indeed recreated as a rational arena for human creativity in all spheres of life, the municipality becomes the ethical space for the good life. And again, it's not the municipalities as we understand them now, or the local authorities as we know them now. It's basically reworking them, reinstituting. Communalism expresses an abiding concept and practice of political life formed by a dialectic of social development and reason. And I find Murray Bookchin's concepts, political concepts and theories really compatible with Cornelius Castoriadis' project of autonomy, who again would be a huge influence in my own political outlooks, but also within my praxis. So again, Castoriadis presents the idea of a society, first of all, I suppose project of autonomy, the most important kind of component or underpinning the whole thing for me is the idea that there is no such thing as an autonomous individual if the society itself isn't autonomous. They're both completely interdependent on each other. And then he presents the idea of a society based upon direct democracy, where all individuals have a role in creating and continuously questioning the institutions that they work with. So this is again the notion of this idea of constant reinstituting. A society that functions on a core principle of continuous self-critique and self-creation, a society that constantly recreates and reconstitutes itself based on its collective response towards the question, what is a good society? Societies and individuals who can genuinely pose that question, he argues, are capable of autonomy. So again, it asks the questions of which institutions then, instead again, taking for granted what we have is a permanent state, a fixed state, and this is all we have and all we deserve. It's asking questions like which institutions do we need to institute, internalize and lean on in our needs and desires. So again, it's a society based on immediate and specific needs as opposed to what currently exists already. What is good for humans and which institutions can help us achieve the good. He presents a way of life in which humans then give laws to themselves. So it's within the kind of collective as opposed to from a top down, as they constantly re-engage in deliberation about what is good, what is reasonable to them. This capacity for autonomy depends also on individuals and society who give limits and laws to themselves. So again, you can't have a society without certain kind of self-limitations. So this is where the notion of social limitation comes into play. And Yavor Turinsky, who himself draws very heavily on both Bookchin and Castoriadis in his work, he talks about it in his book within the idea of by forbidding certain things that society simultaneously draws upon principles regarding what is good and bad for society. What should be done, what cannot be done, therefore giving specific meaning to how we function in life. Because again, we're often led or discriminated against by things that our laws and institutions that we find meaningless to our lives. Even if as an individual we did not personally agree with a specific law or limitation, he argues, due to the fact that we were directly involved in its creation, should at least make that law seem reasonable to us in relation to our society. So again, this idea that if we actually had a say in how things are and how things function on a continuous basis, that we would then respect those laws that we were part of instituting. So these are some of the main sort of prominent concepts underpinning the idea of the living commons, or what a good society could be. So again, as part of my own research practice over the years, I've been mapping and critiquing how what we started calling it a radical pedagogy of collective design. So I started then, as just in my own research interests, looking at how it's being developed again within the kind of cultivation of people-led direct democratic common assembly methods of creating these new social imaginaries. And again, social imaginaries according to Castoriadis, as opposed to other people's understandings. So this basically then brought about kind of an inbuilt self-critique within the development of the living commons through the kind of research praxis that was part of it. So the consideration then of collective design as a holistic scheme of living situates creative practice as a central component to community building, and it's driven by a non-expert ethos that enables self-organized creative initiatives around social living that work outside of conventional schemes of disciplinary learning and practice. So the idea then is to gradually shape this holistic design scheme into a structured social political project and a viable human praxis. And what I mean by that is by something that is just sort of ingrained or integrated into the day-to-day, you know, kind of the everyday of social production. Also, I think it's important to point out that non-expert never assumes, the way we conceive it or we frame it, it never assumes that participants have equal knowledge or experience or abilities, as people obviously have variable social advantages and disadvantages, but a people-led process does assume an equal capacity to contribute and learn and become an active self-empowered member of a community. So again, this is compatible with the cultural theorist Erich Rogoff's argument on placing values on different knowledge systems. So, such as those that would be presented in relation to an urgent issue, and not an issue as defined by knowledge conventions, but by the pressures and struggles of contemporaneity. So again, this is very fitting within our schemes where we have to, where as a collective, we would be responding to the urgent specific needs at any one time, and they would never be the same. You know, you can't assume that we'd be working towards the same goals at any one time as well. So I really like the way that she frames it in the sense that ambition knows. So again, the ambition, the current ambitions of a community, curiosity knows, and poverty knows. So that's hugely important to the ethos of the Living Commons, in that to acknowledge and really recognize the type of knowledge, knowing of the experience of something like poverty gives to somebody, you know, that you know, that in self is kind of an expert knowledge of how you can, you know, of survival and needs. And this is kind of jumping ahead a bit, but just to suffice to say that now the idea of the radical of creating kind of a radical pedagogy out of what we're learning, you know, from the kind of self-critique. I basically started working with a Athenian-based colleague, Dr. Cornelius Castoriadis, from, I think it's about a year now. We met at a conference in Athens, and we've a lot in common. And we both, I was drawing from my experience with Urban React and Living Commons, and a feminist ethnographic kind of approach to research, and she has she's got a lot of experience working with cooperatives in Athens and other sort of activist organizations and stuff. So basically, we merged our research practice interests, and we're after co-founding now Radical Institute. So the Radical Institute is I guess this is the kind of easiest way of kind of summing it up for now. It's exploring how the arts and cultural practice can sustain our individual, collective, and transnational efforts to transform our social political movements and create new worlds. It's to develop new approaches, practices, and tools for ecological, social, and political transformations. And we do this through offering collective mentoring, peer-to-peer learning, training programs, drawing from radical thought and practices within art, architecture, community building, sustainable organizing, as well as from cultural, critical, social, ecological theory. And our methods are holistic, ecosystemic, feminist, and collaborative. And they're all based around the notion of sustainability, you know, of kind of mutual aid and sustainability. We've recently went into partnership with Sample Studios in Cork, and under the project Studios of Sanctuary, and we've been awarded funding from the Community Foundation of Ireland to provide 3 annual residencies for at-risk and marginalised artists that will begin in September. And again, it's working with artists that will supporting or mentoring artists that will be working within kind of a socially engaged program within communities across Cork City. So just a tiny bit of background in Urban React, because there isn't time to go into it now. But as I said, they're currently working on a housing project with the inhabitants of this block. Here you can see in the photographs with they're reclaiming a central courtyard, which you can see there is just currently a car park. What you see there in the plan on the right, the red blocks are empty apartments. and the building itself is quite structurally damaged in places as well. So the ideas of kind of building up a kind of a collective community and renovating the building and renovating the apartments, and then securing them within a co-ownership scheme to safeguard them against the inevitable gentrification of that area. The gentrification was basically prevented by the crisis. So there was kind of a window of time there that made that possible. But it's this project's a really hard slog, and it's ongoing. It hasn't been helped either by COVID, obviously. There's been lots of delays. But the one thing, not the one thing, but what really, I suppose what was really developed in my time with Urban React in Athens was this idea, because Urban React was mainly made up of architects as well, who were really looking for an alternative way of embedding community building into kind of planning, and not in a tokenistic way. So we were really looking then at the type of kind of learning schemes again around that within radical pedagogy frames of thinking. Yeah, so within this type of collective design then, there was a real recognition of this sort of tacit learning occurring, as opposed to kind of this explicit kind of top-down training on the ground as architects or urban planners might do in conventional projects. So it's the idea of framing the community itself and us as the community also as the curriculum, as members are learning, reproducing and innovating through their work together. And again, that kind of thinking was really drawn from the educational theorist Etienne Wenger on community practice, and Joe Curnow, who again writes extensively on radical pedagogies. So my experience then with Urban React really heavily informed how even to approach a project like the Living Commons back in Ireland, through kind of the mistakes we made, you know, again. So what really, this is just kind of a real summary of the main things I brought with me into the Living Commons, which was, first of all, the people-led collective design. If it's to be kind of authentic, it is always shaped through the very, very specific idiosyncratic social context that you're dealing with at any one time. So again, not only could you not like apply the methodological approach that perhaps is emerging in Athens to somewhere in Cork, but no two projects in Cork would ever, you know, apply the same kind of means or methods or whatever thinking. Again, it's that idea, as Irit Rogoff talks about, you know, it's responding to kind of immediate needs within the specificities of that community. The second thing was that it takes time and consistency, like basically full-time commitment. So again, that can't be underestimated. I knew if I was to take on something like the Living Commons, I would have to make that my full-time job, basically, because this is how we really suffered in Urban React. Everybody had jobs, lives, and I was trying to do this, you know, outside of that. So the idea of building up trust and trying to kind of even kind of conceive a kind of a shared sense of community just requires constant sort of engagement and upkeep, and it's so easily lost if there's any kind of break in engagement like that. And then finally, that there would need to be an inbuilt systemic way of dealing with conflict within the collective design process from the get-go, because all too often it's only when conflict arises that all of a sudden we're looking for conflict resolution methods to kind of find our way out of it, and it can be kind of too late by then. So the idea is to really, and we're doing that through the Radical Institute as well, really looking at how we can kind of inbuilt these kind of conflict resolution methods into the process of self-organization from the get-go. And again, what I definitely took from the Urban React experience was that creative practice must be a central component to social organization. And I think that's actually where I kind of differed. I differed in opinion with Urban React and why we kind of parted ways. Because the power within the kind of co-creation of schemes, and even the smaller kind of projects just couldn't be underestimated in terms of community building and gaining that trust, as I said, which has to be constantly kind of maintained. So one of the main schemes that came out of this time, this collaboration in Athens, was architecture activism, which is we framed as a collective curatorial model that employs art, architecture, practice, research, exhibition as an interface for activism, a critique of state institutions, as well as targeting arts funding to initiate long-term social projects challenging precarious social living conditions. And the two main projects then that came out of that was, the first one was a large exhibition collective called Inhabiting the Baggian, which was kind of showcased. It was actually involved Athenian and Irish artists, activists and organizations. And it, over 4 floors of an empty hotel in Athens, is showcased kind of alternative ways of organizing, basically. And then Spare Room, which I co-produced with the artist Kate O'Shea in Cork in 2019, and that was funded by the Irish Arts Council. But just before talking about Spare Room, this is another collaboration that came out of my time with Urban React. We produced this ethnographic project where we interviewed the older inhabitants of the building. And the work basically then interweaves the biographies of the people with the really, really complex social, historical, political history of the building itself. And this work has been exhibited so far in Cork, Dublin, Bern in Switzerland, and Athens. And again, I just think it's a good example of how something like a housing project, which might, you know, ordinarily be kind of disseminated through some type of kind of publication, but how within this sort of exhibitionary or curatorial scheme can enable the viewer, the observer, to really engage with something like this on a different level, on maybe kind of a more human and emotive level. And then, yeah, so that brings me to the Living Commons, as I said, which was informed by Urban React, but again, had to speak very specifically into the kind of Irish context, you know, of why we need this in Ireland. So the idea was again to have it developed through collectively led social, ecological, cultural programs that enabled those in precarious living situations. And because it was set up by artists, cultural workers, we also include, you know, art workers, cultural workers within the idea of precarity, as well as acknowledging and recognizing, obviously, that there are lots worse off. You know, there's like lots of different kind of levels of precarity, but it's basically to enable people equal participation in social, cultural, economic, and political life through the initiation of these autonomously run collective design programs. So again, part of it was to look at to really kind of research and look what kind of existed around us, and see how then we might kind of work together within our, even to try and make visible the kind of social network there. And again, it was conceived in a direct response to the very neoliberal Irish context, and particularly this idea of the normalization of crisis and poverty, and this dominant narrative that we were being fed, you know, that we're all somehow very complicit in our own sense of crisis. And despite, well, that in itself would cause widespread apathy and disillusionment, but also just very weirdly how despite successive parties causing crisis further, you know, putting society into further and further crisis, but by kind of honoring the markets over kind of human needs, people yet look to party politics to resolve problems. So this for me is the biggest sort of kind of state of confusion, or kind of the danger of normalizing things of like crisis and poverty as being somehow society's fault. And I find this really aligns as well. This is why I included the quote here with Bookchin's argument of how the the state, and I'd say here the Irish state, justifies its existence in great part not only on the indifference, I would say the apathy or the disillusionment of its constituents to public affairs, but also significantly on the alleged inability of its constituents to manage public affairs. And again, so that's really what the Living Commons wanted to kind of target more specifically. It was to kind of enable us to be able to not just to self-organize, but to be able to create the whole kind of schemes, the infrastructures, the kind of supportive emotional structures that we would need in order to be able to kind of tend to, you know, kind of our everyday needs. So again, with as I mentioned before, the Irish Arts Council funded the Spare Room project, which ran for 2 weeks in the TSB Bank in North Main Street in Cork City. And it was, again, specifically addressing the Irish housing crisis. So it brought together different groups, projects, people from all over, basically, to kind of either showcase, exhibit their work, or to contribute through workshops, discussions, excuse me. And again, it was this idea of having kind of a shared platform of people from very different organizations and places who wouldn't necessarily organize together, but to kind of bring people together over kind of a common need. And so again, we held, it was 23 workshops, discussions, all around kind of different commoning practices, eating, making, seed banking, reinstituting, printing, again, a conflict resolution, etc. As you can see from the pictures, and for those that have visited it, it was a really lively social area and attracted all different kind of age groups and different demographics. But I think for me, mostly it really highlighted the need for a free social space, indoor social space in Cork City. Particularly when it was raining, people would just come in with their buggies and stuff to stand in from the rain, and then they'd sit down, engage with the work or have a chat or whatever. We had teenagers as well from the Educate Together school, and that was really interesting because, again, it was that kind of realization of the lack of spaces for teenagers, even though they're constantly being demonized, particularly in the time of COVID, for how they gather and organize, but yet they've absolutely no dignified spaces given to them. So this brings me up to date. This is hopefully our new space that we're waiting any day to get in again, just due to COVID. There's been delays, but this is on Shandon Street, the old bakery. And we've again got funding for this year's project, which is called the Living Commons Reconfiguring the Social, and is funded by the Irish Arts Council. And again, it's the idea of bringing different, you know, building upon Spare Room, but now trying to make it more long-term, kind of into the future. And it'll fund different programs, collaborative programs around social ecology, around kind of holistic and sustainable living. And they will then serve as the basis for setting up the Living Commons into the future. So some of these that we've been able to work on over Zoom in the last couple of months is Reconfigurable Structures, and that is artist Rob Arson and Alex O'Brien, who's a permaculturist and educator, and Berlin-based architect Aideen O'Donovan. And Aideen and Rob worked with us in Spare Room as well. So they're making these, they're co-designing, co-creating these amazing reconfigurable structures that are COVID, take in the kind of COVID social distancing, should there be a need. They work indoors and outdoors. And basically the idea is that we'll use them, and whoever else needs them to use them. They can be kind of reconstructed into different configurations. If you need a schoolroom, if you need an exhibition space, a theater space, or whatever. So that's the idea. And they kind of compact, and they can be easily transported as well. And then the second thing that, again, should be underway now, but it's hopefully this week we'll start working on it, is paideia. So that's the Greek for the kind of Greek philosophy around schooling, that, you know, learning through life as opposed to kind of within set kind of curriculums and school life. And the idea first was to create kind of have teenagers set up their own radical school, But again, just because of what was occurring within the kind of real crisis of space for younger people during COVID, that now has kind of developed into teenage activists, again, from different activist organizations coming together with their mentors, workshopping, how they might self-organize through, starting with kind of creating a charter of values and principles. And then basically, creating their own autonomous sort of self-organized space for whatever needs, it's up to them. And then once they're at that point, they will have access to the space. They'll run the space. Excuse me, that's my alarm. They'll run the space. Basically we'll give them the space for whatever, once or twice a week. And then finally, as I'll finish up here, the Radical Institute are collaborating with the Living Commons in creating then an annual program of events, workshops, discussions and meetings, which again, it will be set up for the long term. So the idea is to kind of embed ourselves, create a social cultural space on Shandon Street, have it open to people, to existing organizations and those we've worked with before through Spare Room, to come in and kind of co-program things for, for new projects, for existing projects, to again, try and create kind of this solid network of people and organizations that'll kind of serve as a foundational basis. I'd like to end with this quotation from Bookchin, because I find it very hopeful. He talks about citizens must be capable intellectually as well as physically of performing all the necessary functions in their community that today are undertaken by the state. Once citizens are capable of self-management, the state can be liquidated both institutionally and subjectively, replaced by free and educated citizens in popular assemblies. So again, that's very much sort of the kind of outlook of the Living Commons, of kind of just not accepting the way things are, and not really engaging in projects like housing projects that already have kind of a kind of like an assumption that homelessness will always prevail, will always exist. So we're trying to go from the opposite end of, no, we want to start with this, to try and kind of break that assumption that homelessness does not need to exist, and build kind of from there, from that point of view, as opposed to just accommodating homelessness into our plans. And yeah, finally, these are just some of the organizations now we're currently working with Self-Organized Architecture and others on looking at building up a community land trust in Cork. And also I'm a founding member of the Cork Democratic School, and we're ready to go basically to set up the first sort of self-directed learning for kids in Cork. We're just lacking a building, hence needing a community land trust in Cork as well. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully I've been able to show how they're all kind of interrelated and all part of kind of the same plan. But thanks for listening. I'll stop sharing here.
Okay, thanks so much, Eve, for such a brilliant introduction to so many projects, so many ideas, but also so many intellectual and political references, which it's quite interesting to see how everything somehow is connected to everything. Mm-hmm. How praxis is informed by theory and research, but also by political radical thinking, because I could not avoid understanding particularly through the references and the quotes, a lot of anarchist, not ideology, but kind of frameworks, intellectual frameworks. So that's quite interesting for me personally, but also in general, specifically because there was this impactful moment where you referred to the current neoliberal state in which we live, state as a conditioned state, as within the Irish state and governments. And for a foreigner like me being here, it's almost like, I have the impression that neoliberalism was actually founded in this place, and kind of in this territory precedes what we understand as the historic framework from the late 70s onwards. And it's quite fundamental to not only be able to hear from you, but also understand the network of collaborations and solidarities that you bring together into all these projects. And most important for me, and I think I will open up soon, is also how you are paving the ground to what's next, and really focus on, and this is something I'd like to ask you, is this kind of long-term commitment to ideas and projects that basically became alive and exist beyond the typical framework of production, consumption, and try to go beyond that. So I'm actually curious to ask you, just to start, and then everyone will have their opportunity. Also because you refer several times to the funding bodies, particularly the Arts Council of Ireland, who has been supporting some of these projects. I'm interested to understand from you, what are the dilemmas or the tensions or the issues that you may found between these systems of funding and systems of cultural production that are very driven towards consumption and objects and production, against this type of work, which seems to require a much larger time frame, a deeper breadth, almost like a commitment that is beyond the typical project/job.
Well, I suppose one way of answering that is just that I suppose we're being strategic. So it's from the beginning, looking for funding, different kinds of funding. Like, so just for example, inhabiting the Baggian, I did a GoFundMe and I got a credit union loan, and I then got some money from Culture Ireland. So it was real kind of slap, you know what I mean? Literally just kind of picking things and hoping it'll all hold together. At the moment, there isn't a conflict for me personally with the Irish Arts Council funding, and that's come into being only in the last couple of years. Anyway, there's some individuals who have been incredibly kind of supportive to this kind of work in general. I think it's not just our work, obviously, but there seemed in the last couple of years, I mean, this is now only just on my own kind of observation. I could, others might think differently, but there seems to be a lot more of these kind of more radical projects being funded, which is just very encouraging. And again, at the same time, I'd be skeptical enough to know that this isn't going to last, probably. It will be co-opted at some point, but it's good at the moment and it serves our needs at the moment. Saying that again, and actually I need to point out that Rob is part of the Living Commons, so he's part, when I'm talking, it's we, it's not me, and others obviously. But then the idea of being strategic is again having kind of alliances with like-minded, but different professional and different, so people would have maybe different immediate concerns, but we would have an overlap in interests. So again, with self-organized architecture, we wouldn't necessarily be coming with exactly the same kind of value systems or whatever, but I mean, I really admire what they do. For some reason, they've had an interest in the Living Commons, even though it's not the typical type of project that they showcase. And so we've built up kind of a nice, kind of relationship there. And again, now it's really interesting. I hope Eleanor doesn't mind me saying, I know she's part of it too, but we're looking into this idea of community land trusts. Eleanor's group Plot as well have been doing this independently in their own, with their own kind of funded projects as well. So again, it's just really encouraging that these things are kind of happening simultaneously around, and that we can all kind of get together maybe under one scheme and push it. Saying that, then that opens then other funding avenues, and so again, with the idea of trying to build kind of a holistic scheme, the arts funding is really, really useful for actually focusing the mind in how these programs can be conceived. So again, I mean, I just feel that so strongly that creative practice really needs to be taken seriously as an agitator, you know, a proper kind of social agitator. It is so vital in that kind of creative, strategic thinking. Artists are used to making something out of nothing, you know. I think, yeah, I just think it just can't be underestimated. So within those programs, then within an arts project now, you can bring in lawyers, you can bring in different professions, you can bring in different kind of members of the community into this kind of scheme, which has a really creative, amazing, you know, very kind of engaging kind of core to it, but then can also have really serious kind of social impact out there as well. So that's incredibly kind of exciting, because that I know when I started in Cork, 2012, that didn't exist. There was like not a hope of doing anything like this, or even I can remember, yeah, having conversations with people in the city council, just like looking at me like I was mad. Whereas now, as I said, that there's an awful lot of people kind of engaged in those. And then the last thing I'd say is part of that kind of strategy is kind of reaching out beyond Ireland as well. So I think that's incredibly important. So we've done that not only just with Athens, but Rob and myself were part of a kind of a more kind of international commons group, support group, for want of a better word, and we traveled to Marseille on, it was kind of a commoning camp. And through that initiative, we made contacts with particularly this group now who are currently mentoring us. They're a group of legal professionals, so lawyers, administrators, researchers of the law, mainly from France and Spain, but other places also. And they're currently mentoring us and learning about the Irish legal system, you know, so there's a lovely kind of mutual exchange, and that they're really helping us. Again, against like our main concerns would be not being co-opted. What kind of structures can we put in place that we can kind of safeguard the core group, the core values, without being dictated, you know what I mean, without kind of imposing our beliefs on others, but we still want to protect the kind of central ethos, the central heart, anti-capitalist ethic ethos from others coming in and wanting to change that. So there, yeah, so it's basically that, it's just like this kind of ongoing massive support, kind of finding your people sort of thing, where people are just really, really happy to support each other. And yeah, I just think the timing as well has an awful lot to do with it. The timing just seems right at the moment for some reason. So it's great. It's hopeful.
Okay, so I have a few other things that I could discuss with you, but I'd rather open up immediately to anyone who wants to make a comment, ask a question, reflection. Eleanor, you were mentioned, or Rob, or anyone else?
I'll go if nobody else is ready. I was waiting there. Yeah. I just think, well done, Eve. You know, really, this is so exciting. I feel like I was working on kind of, you know, projects with a lot of overlap, but very much in the activist community for the last 20 years, because as you say, this just wasn't happening in the arts community, and the kind of projects, anarchist type structured projects that I wanted to be involved in, just, yeah, people, there wasn't the interest really, do you know the way, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think the most important thing really now is to create these really strong solidarity networks, and the fact that they can be created now through different practices is really, I find that incredibly exciting at the moment. But I think, yeah, I mean, COVID is definitely this massive window of opportunity. We don't know, it's very, very exciting because you really don't know. There's so many ways things could go, you know, dystopian and utopian, but it's a really, really, it's one of the most exciting moments in my life, I think, for opportunity or for potential, you know, opportunity to really make real change. Yeah, so, you know, well done for working away on this for so long. And I think that's the thing, I suppose it's getting older as well, but you know, I'm only really interested in being involved in projects that have a really long term,
yes,
you know, I like going back to projects that I'd done, you know, 15 years ago, and kind of seeing how people are getting on there, and that, you know, you can still make links even if a project originally wasn't intended to last for 10 or 15 years. But yeah, anyway, just, yeah, well done, you and Rob.
can I actually just, what Eleanor raised is really interesting, actually. I came back to Cork around, I can't even remember now, but it was around that time. So, and I went straight into the National Sculpture Factory expecting, and I wasn't part of the arts or anything. I had just finished my PhD, and I targeted the National Sculpture Factory because I thought in my head that artists were automatically kind of anarchists, or, you know, were very politically driven. And then I found that wasn't the case. But sorry, Rob, to put you on the spot, I mean, I can ask you tomorrow at the meeting, but I'm really curious. Like Eleanor was saying that just didn't exist, but do you have a different experience from Belfast?
From Belfast, I suppose there's more space for like radical community projects in Belfast. I think just because any kind of alternative to the kind of, I don't know, like dualistic kind of like conflict sort of situation, but funding radical projects is a completely different thing, and it does seem really inspiring that the Arts Council, for whatever reason, now feel able to fund more radical projects. I suppose the influence of kind of like social practices has maybe kind of like allowed them to see wider than just you know, producing a piece of work and then selling it kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, Eve, just for a little bit of background, you know, like in 2001, there would have been, it was kind of the whole kind of 9/11 thing, I suppose, but what's happening now with artists suddenly happened in the activist community in Cork, and all these different groups all came together, and we set up this space, this autonomous space, which lasted for about 2 or 3 years, and then it kind of became nomadic for a few more years, and then we opened a bookshop, and then we opened another bookshop. So it was about 10, 11 years worth of running these hubs which had arts activities. So, you know, I kind of saw it as taking my arts activity into the activist world, and now what I feel is I'm taking all that activist experience for sort of 30 years of my life back into the art one. It's really the first time I've ever done that in such a long, you know, a way of working on a long term project. So yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of incredibly exciting projects, but it did have a big arts, and I just thought that was misleading when I was saying it wasn't happening at all. You know, there were people, obviously artists, who were involved in kind of projects that were mainly in a sort of activist sphere, but they weren't being arts led, and they certainly weren't being led with any funding, you know, or definitely not arts funding.
I guess, Eve, to go back to what you were saying, I think potentially one shift in context is the more, maybe, and you can correct me if you don't, I mean, or you can make a comment, but I've as much as kind of the market driven economy and it became dominant, say, the more conscious, kind of almost like collective conscience for social needs, and starts to emerge as relevant. So no more things for profit, but things based on social need or collective need, or as you said, common needs. And I suspect that whether it is in the art sector or beyond, this consciousness has been evolving, creating space and opportunities for counter narratives to emerge and solidify, whether or not they are part of a revolutionary project that aims to change the system, or whether or not they are informed by that, or whether or not they are, you know, inserting moments of tension in the mainstream. But I guess that's what the shift in the landscape that you were referring to, the more sort of like social need becoming more urgent in times of crises, like you were describing, crises that are provoked, not necessarily provoked by external agents or factors, but they are intrinsic to the way of life in which we live. And so that's where you see all these different forces emerging here or there. And also the fact that communications are easier today enable this solidarity, both at a national or, you know, communal level or international level, to develop with more emphasis and strength.
Mm.
But I was actually, if no one wants to intervene, I was, I mean, I took some notes, and I have things like, yeah, you mentioned common needs. There was a very interesting passage around material and philosophical process of community building. So, for instance, could we unpack maybe some of the ideas just slightly more, or even the idea of reinstitution from Castoriadis? So, can you maybe give us a little bit of an example? How do you see this in reality, even with respect to some of the projects that you just mentioned?
Yeah.
Say, an alternative school, or a truly democratic school, or a new curriculum. How do you see this?
Yeah, that like it's that idea of, first of all, of taking a concept like reinstituting, and again, maybe a couple of years, I don't know how many years ago, kind of putting that idea across, and people just not believing, just saying, you can't do that, it's just not possible. Everything's just too fixed. It is the way it is. There's no alternative beyond capitalism. But then when you're working within more kind of a local level, that you can do this. And that's what I mean about material and philosophical. So as you're making, as you're doing and changing, it's changing people's perception because they're seeing something different, so it's that kind of altering the kind of social landscape and then opening up possibilities. So taking the radical school or the Paideia as an example, it was simply the idea of, yes, one of the institutions in crisis is school. Our obsession with the Leaving Cert, and I have 2 kids that are just both tortured and torturing me on a daily basis, getting through this system. So it was the idea then of just, well, then how would we reinstitute schools? Well, the first thing is that somebody my age wouldn't be doing that, because then again, that's top down, me telling people how to do things. So through the different projects that we're involved in, I spoke to some mentors. So it would have been Mags O'Sullivan from the Cork Travellers Women's Network, Fionnuala and Raphael from the Cork Migrant Centre, Helen O'Keefe from Life Centre. Anyway, so people who've been mentoring teenagers and teenagers who've been in different kind of forms of activism, whether it was Black Lives Matters or kind of social ecological issues or whatever. So it was an idea of, because this wouldn't work with, the average teenager. It would have to be I keep saying teenager, but young people who are kind of really kind of used to kind of thinking this way, who have the frustration, who have the motivation. So it was an idea of just bringing them together, introducing the idea of reinstituting, but with a very kind of serious, we're deadly serious about this. It was like, okay, well, whatever comes out of this, then that will be the school of the living commons. So it's not just setting up an idea of the social imaginary, it's actually reinstituting. It's like, yes, we will run this as a school. What happened since was I discovered this wonderful group that are already setting up a direct democratic school and have been doing, researching and looking at it for 2 years. As I said, then the kind of focus shifted to this idea of an actual kind of an autonomously run space. That came from one of the workshops as well I did with Kate O'Shea when she did the My Generation project in the Glucksmith. So I went in for one workshop with the young people there. And it was just a very simple premise. I said to them, okay, if the city gave you one of the many, many empty shops in city centre right now, how would you run it? How would you organize yourselves? What would you do with it? Would you even know where to start? Or, it wasn't that. But it was this idea. And again, you can see it's just that idea of a possibility happening. And then through the reconfigurable structures that Rob is part of as well. The idea with this project is, yes, we run them, but then we also bring them out into public spaces around the city centre as nearly like a performance. So we run the school, so passers-by can see how we're doing it. And again, it's just a kind of I mean, I think that's what the creative practice arts can do best as well, is kind of represent different types of kind of possibilities to people. So yeah, so that would be one of them. And then the other is, again, with the kind of community land trust, or looking at the kind of how one of the workshops we're doing as well is legalizing the commons. How would you even, you know, begin to kind of find the loopholes, whatever, within the law, or change the law in order to have a commoning project such as the Living Commons, a legal entity, like legally recognizable. So we have the legal lab working on that and bringing in different people as well to see how, you know, and then that becomes a reality. You know what I mean? It's like a possibility, a real possibility. So yeah, it's working bit by bit, basically, in a very kind of local context. And then, and that's literally how Bookchin and Castoriadis also kind of conceives, or the idea of the project of autonomy, or social, or municipalism. It's starting on that local level, giving power back at that local level. And then, you know, that can be kind of reproduced over and over again. So.
Okay, I can ask another question. If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Can I just mention one thing, because I can see them there, Katerina. So I am just picking on people now, and Sarah Jane. So again, just sorry that you've just kind of reminded me of, again, this idea of kind of holistic scheme, and what Eleanor was talking about the real need for solidarity. So again, I'm really sorry for pointing you out and talking about your work like this. But Katerina is working within projects within mental health, and specifically looking at the health workers, the detrimental effect on their mental health during COVID. And Sarah Jane has set up a group that I'm part of called Rage, a feminist collective. And we're specifically looking as well at the moment at support workers of domestic violence, and the horrendous, it's so depressing, the research for this particular project. But again, it's kind of gaining that kind of insight or knowledge through these arts programs. And then you can try and integrate the needs held within those sort of different sort of spheres into different kind of programs as well. You know, so again, it would be, now it's become a big concern within just say the Living Commons space, that, oh, how could we create a safe space? How could we maybe work with different groups, different existing kind of support groups, organizations, in trying to kind of like work together to kind of conceive a new kind of space, or a new kind of way of creating solidarity around people's needs. So one of the things we're looking at with Sarah Jane as well is this idea of not simply, but starting with the kind of a premise of domestic violence as a community issue, as opposed to like a domestic issue. You know, no, it's, you know, and because obviously laws are failing people, so that's redundant. It doesn't work. So what should we look at then? So again, for me, all of these kind of really feed into that idea of municipalism as well, and kind of networks of solidarity.
And so when you were referring to Urban React, and then how do you translate it? How do you translate some of the learnings and the findings from that project, say, in the context of operating in Athens and to Cork, and then some of your thinking and some of your practice evolved into what is now the Living Commons. So there was that moment, spare room, which you described, 2019. So maybe a few months before the first lockdown, 6 months before. So maybe could you now reflecting on that and moving from that moment into where we are now with, say, the pandemic here in between, are there other learnings and findings or mistakes that you think might have been made, or things that you may want to avoid in now laying the ground for what comes next, in setting up some of these ideas, in making them, putting them in practice, and evolving, because you also mentioned there is now a space in Shandon that you want to occupy. So what can you share with others that may be invested in practice that have some commonalities with yours, What can you share in terms of like, ways of working collectively? What have you not done here in Cork that took place in Athens that you felt was not interesting, or was kind of like, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different ways of kind of approaching that, but like, I suppose one of the main kind of differences or learning curves between Athens and here is the municipalities. I actually, in Athens, learned what a municipality is, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense. So I'd only ever think of, local authority, the city council, or whatever. Never thought of it in any way of serving any, this sounds terrible, but yeah, I never had any connection to it as a citizen, let's say. Whereas in Castoriadis, historically, it's a communist sort of stronghold during the Civil War, and that's why the building was targeted. You see all the kind of bullet holes and stuff. So it historically, then, it's still the municipality. When we started the project, had a communist socialist mayor. So there was this, it just blew my mind that, that there would be a mayor who was anti-capitalist and shared our values and beliefs or ideas on developers, the dirty developers, and would in no way succumb to that, so we're backing Urban React in kind of maintaining the building as it was. And, obviously now there's a terrible right-wing government there and things, So that was a huge learning curve, and the idea of time as well within that time frame. We've only got a few years now, because then Syriza came in and completely devastated any type of idea of change. And you just knew the pendulum was going to swing back to right wing. So then applying that, then that really kind of opened my eyes to, how would I even begin to engage with city council here in those terms? And that took a long time. Actually, it took up to now to like working with the SOA to even kind of consider that now as an option, and again, I don't think I would have done it independently. I'm not sure. Rob can speak for Living Commons as well, but I'm not sure Living Commons would have broached that, because again, with the experience of spare room, we've really kind of experienced the thing of being co-opted by people and being taken for a ride by developers and whatnot, and being promised things that never materialized, so I suppose we just kind of persevered, and I suppose the idea as well was that we wouldn't say no to anybody, but it was to take people. This is one thing I mainly learned actually in Athens, was not to think of the institutions, but to work with individuals. So even because Urban React was very much an anarchist group, so there was no way they would take state money, European funding, anything like that. And they wouldn't work with any existing institutions, state institutions, but they would work with individuals. So kind of on this sort of autonomous kind of level. So this, the main thing that came out of COVID for me was time, that when you're given time, how much you can actually achieve. Eleanor definitely alluded to that earlier. And how much time you're not allowed really. There's always kind of a time frame where you have to achieve things or show sort of some sort of output. Whereas when you're actually given time to really think about things and develop things, the Zoom conversations we've had. So for example, the reconfigurable furniture, we've been talking, Rob, I think for like 6 months, I mean, we've had that time to really develop it with no stress on having to kind of have anything materialize till we're ready. And again, with the kind of crisis of properties now, all the empty properties across Cork City, has also given the powers that be, let's say, less of kind of an argument against giving them. So we're currently looking for kind of tax exemption, or not rates exemptions and stuff like that, in order for us to be able to survive. So that kind of change in circumstances is definitely more in our favor, as it's becoming more visible why people need support. Other than that, I mean, again, there's kind of lots of ways I could kind of approach that question, but the main thing would have been kind of, yeah, time, developing and learning from loads of mistakes, basically.
And and what is the, and can you share with us a bit more the plans now? So for instance, this space you mentioned in Shandon, what is the ambition? Is it to have it running, functioning, let's say, from September onwards?
Next week, Rob, please. We've been told, like,
So.
yeah, we have the space in that he is ready to give us the keys. We're waiting on the city council to get back to us regarding rates. So this is ongoing, daily phone calls, and I'm hoping to get an answer tomorrow. And as soon as we get the answer, we're in, basically. So yeah, and yeah, the idea is to set it up as like an open, like it's a really nice 2 big window kind of facing out onto the street, to have it a very lively social space that people can kind of come into. Obviously it'll be closed off when there's different programmed events happening, but we will have, like, yeah, we'll have a program of events, and then we'll have slots where we'll basically be calling people around and seeing if it's of any use to them. It's in time to kind of engage with the community in not a forced way, you know what I mean, in a gradual sense, getting a sense of the place, letting people get a sense of us. So far, we've just spoken to a few people in the shops and stuff, and they've all been very positive about the idea of the space being used like that, including the shop owners. So yeah, so as I said, we want this kind of into the kind of longer term. And it's a great place as well for just kind of even just discussions, kind of community assemblies, discussions into the future, as well as a kind of a central place for people to organize. And yeah.
Okay, so I have one final question, which would be now to withdraw a bit from reality practice projects and go back to your political and intellectual references. So my first question is, if you could trace a little bit your trajectory within it, say, because yeah, you are a scholar as well, and you earned your PhD, say, 10 years ago, but thinkers like Castoriadis or Bookchin, they're not necessarily part of the canon of, say, academic research, say in anthropology or architecture or the fields that you are coming from. They are much more part of, like, say, traditions of radical alternative political thinking, although Castoriadis also has maybe a foot in a more conventional academia, if you can say this. So I was wondering whether you could share where your encounter with these political references and intellectual references, how it evolved. And on the other hand, if you maintain currently any connectivity with other people, both either in Ireland or beyond, at that level of political discussion, alternative thinking, radical thinking towards a sort of an utopian project of transformation of society.
Yeah, absolutely. So just again, kind of in summary, I began as a teenager in the socialist workers movement, being recruited by Richard Boyd Barrett, I think during an anti-Nazi league thing. And then after 3 years, just running like for my life out of the SWM. It was a very scary place to be, and being incredibly, just disillusioned, thinking if that socialism, wasn't it. Marxism was sexist. There was just huge problems with the kind of political stuff I was reading. And then after my PhD, I was looking at more kind of radical anthropology, and that really shifted my thinking. It just again started giving me hope. And again, it was all about these sort of alternative ways of thinking. People now like Michael Taussig, Paul Stoller, Andrew Motu. So these real radical anthropologists who literally changed how what's accepted now, even in academia. And so Chantal Mouffe and Simon Sheikh. So again, I was kind of reading around kind of social political kind of thinkers, but nothing, again, I just found them quite elitist. I mean, that's fair enough to say, you know what I mean? So they're theorists, they don't espouse to be anything other than theorist thinkers. I found that quite frustrating. And then in Athens, all of a sudden Castoriadis was everywhere, and I just couldn't believe I'd gone through 15 years of academia and never heard of him. I actually went back to all my references and checked all their bibliographies, and the only reference I could find to him was one paper on the public sphere by Simon Sheik. So I became completely suspicious and curious as to how come, and basically that was my eureka moment, like Castoriadis, the idea of even the social imaginary, project of autonomy, it just completely, it was like, that was the answer for me. There was something, there was an alternative that I felt was possible. And also the kind of level of activism in Athens is, you know, an anarchism, but also that was a really good kind of learning curve, because I found a lot of it, most of it, really macho, really patriotic, like, or not patriotic, real patriarchal sort of kind of dominant, you know, basically if you don't agree with us, you're shit sort of thing, or, you know, and this sort of machismo as well, that I just really, and I'm not saying that was all men, that's general, you know, that's not even gendering it, which I just really, really disliked as well. So yeah, so it was that, it was just being really, really cynical about what's happening kind of on the street, or not on the street, but at the street kind of level within activism in Athens, within my own group then, within Urban React, the kind of dynamics that were going on there also were really interesting. I learned a lot from that. But then it was through meeting Yevvar Turinsky, who online, actually I came across him online, and he was the only person that I could see that was writing about Castoriadis. So I got in contact with him, we became friends. I learned about Murray Bookchin through him as well. And then I delivered a paper at the TRISE, he's part of TRISE, which is the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology, which was founded by Murray Bookchin in Canada, in Montreal. And so I became then a member of TRISE, and I still am, so that's ongoing. And yeah, TRISE are very much about that. Again, difficult to see where, you know, what direction it will go in, because everybody is very dispersed around the world, basically. So it's, for me, it's more sort of kind of a think tank, if for want of a better word, where I suppose we kind of follow a particular kind of ideological kind of way of thinking around an alternative, like a feasible alternative. And then actually, which is really important, is to see the product of that as well in what's happening in Rojava with Auckland, who basically adapted Murray Bookchin's framing of municipalism into communities, Kurdish communities, and it was working really well till obviously the Turkish tried to disseminate them, and the Zapatistas as well. So it's kind of looking at those two, you know, which obviously is so different. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. We can kind of mimic that in Cork, obviously not, but it's just amazing that these things, again, you can see these things existing. And I didn't have that before. I didn't have that kind of hope or motivation, actually. So it's things like that that can keep you really motivated, actually. Yeah, that these things do exist and can kind of continue.
Okay. Greg is asking in his comments, I heard there might be over 1 million people in Rojava making decisions in community assemblies. Is that correct?
It's as far, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but just from reading articles about it, again, it's within kind of different kind of networks of assemblies. It's a huge, again, I mean, this is stuff I've only come across in the last couple of years, but it's like massive mass of land as well, you know, of population and land. Just Janet Beale as well, who was worked with Murray Bookchin for years. She's written kind of extensively on him as well, and she's got a documentary coming out soon, I think. But things which were just mind-boggling in that the idea, Auckland really kind of adapted the idea of the kind of feminization of politics, and the kind of, it's not social conditioning, but it's more, again, just say in relation to the patriarchy and discrimination against women and violence against women, that there would be, they would go into, or the communities themselves would be organized within kind of training as how to not, you know, within, so couples would be trained, the men would be trained, the women would be trained. Again, this is not something that, you know, I'm kind of advocating to be repeated, because it is a bit, Auckland's interpretation can be viewed a little bit as top down, but it is, you know, but it is, yeah, collective assemblies agreeing, and they've done really interesting all I can say actually here is, because I'll just ramble on about stuff I don't know completely about, but what I would really recommend is even roar.org have amazing essays on from Rojava and things that are going on with, like, within their alternative legal systems, again, which seem to be women-led, and how they deal with very specific sort of situations and issues that are, again, specific to their kind of social, cultural, whatever context. But yeah, sorry, that was very rambling, but.
Eve and Rob, probably, I just wanted to reference, like Miguel mentioned the Institute of Radical Imagination at the beginning of the list. And there's a fantastic archive. They have a fantastic archive. I've been watching taking part in a few of their webinars for the last few months. But they've got a really interesting archive of all their artist presentations and webinars, and there's some really, really appropriate ones for, that involve Zapatista.
Okay.
Some Mexican. There's about 4 of them now, I think. I watched 2 of them. And there was one project that is so inspiring. It's just absolutely extraordinary. They basically took over a whole, I think it was the United Nations building. People were protesting. They wanted more democratic kind of structure and something. Mm-hmm. So they took over. They basically went into the building. They put so much pressure that the United Nations moved out. They just abandoned it, the building. They moved away. So basically, everybody moved into it and set it up as this incredible political arts center. And just had all these, and I think it went on, it lasted for about 4 years, and all these really extraordinary projects happened. But anyway, there's a whole load of really inspiring stuff on the website. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, Eve, thank you so much for the genuine, fantastic presentation and genuine conversation, and for sharing so much of you, not only intellectually but personally, so much of your projects, so much of your ideas. It has been a fantastic journey today, and into a lot of fundamental work that you've been doing, and a lot of fundamental thinking that is out there that somehow we may encounter through you and through your work and through your projects. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you so much all of you who attended today. As I mentioned, we will continue our series in September. Those of you who may want to receive further information, and you can register to receive our e-bulletin, the series Art Center e-bulletin, where we share what's next, but you also can check our social media channels. And some of you might have the opportunity to pay us a visit on site in Cove. We are now open Wednesday to Friday, 11 to 4. And there will be more events and more programs being launched during July and September. And hopefully past that, we will continue operating almost within the conditions that were preceding COVID-19. More work will be done, more work that will help us imagine a new world and an alternative world, including the work that Eve is doing. All right, and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks everybody for coming. It's great.
That's brilliant.
Enjoy the rest of your
Thanks.
evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks.